The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Over the last 150 years, approximately 1,500 people have been hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
The evidence is so overwhelming that they have to tell the truth.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
That's almost a different story, isn't it?
Searching for new evidence.
The victim is looking for any means of escape that might be available.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? In rural Leicestershire, on the evening of the 25th of April 1825, ex-soldier James Reed was reported missing by his wife Hannah. A manhunt began, led by James's brother Thomas. The following morning, James Reed's lifeless body was found in the old Union Canal. As Hannah Reed was the last person to see James alive, she became the prime suspect in connection with his death. Thomas Reed claimed that Hannah pushed James into the water and drowned him. Despite protesting her innocence, she was charged with murder. On the 3rd of August 1825, after a trial that lasted only a single day, during which Hannah Reed had no legal representation, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Michael Packwood, a relative of Hannah Reed, has been researching her case for over 12 years.
I started to have a look at this and I thought, no, this is not right. This doesn't look right. This needs looking at.
Michael's son Mike also feels that Hannah's conviction was a miscarriage of justice.
She didn't do it. I know she didn't do it. I mean, everything that's put in there, none of it adds up. I do believe it's a serious injustice, and it would be nice to see it examined, looked into.
Nearly 200 years on from her execution, Michael hopes to find justice for Hannah Reed.
It would mean to me that all the research that I have done over the last 12 years...
And your beliefs?
And my beliefs would be justified.
The case against Hannah Reed was a controversial one due to lack of eyewitnesses and minimal concrete evidence. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern-day legal team reach a different conclusion? Jeremy Dean QC has over 30 years' experience as a barrister and will be leading the defence. Sasha Was QC is one of the country's most formidable prosecutors. However, in this investigation, if she finds evidence that doubts the conviction, she will raise it. Michael and Mike have come to London to meet the barristers.
Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
How do you do, Michael? Jeremy.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
So, Michael, when did you first hear about the case of Hannah Reed?
About 2006, when I joined the internet revolution, and through a genealogy website, and I had an email from Australia, from a descendant of the Reed family, who informed me that one of my family killed one of his family.
Right.
And that was when I first started looking at it, because then I thought, no, this is something wrong with this story. This was basically a love story that had a tragic end.
So you're aware that Hannah Reed didn't have legal representation. How do you feel about that?
After reading everything my father had put together regarding the case, so I was of the same thoughts as him. And I and my father both felt that she just needed a voice.
And of course, it was a jury of 12 men.
12 men. There was no women involved. There had no women on the jury. She never stood a chance.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and Jeremy and I are going to go away now, and hopefully we'll have some news for you when we next meet, all right?
Thank
So
you.
lovely to meet you.
All right.
Thank you.
Excellent. Very good to meet you.
Hannah Reid was born Hannah Packwood in 1789. Her early life was one of grinding poverty and a failed marriage, during which she gave birth to 2 children. Things seemed to change for the better when in 1816, Hannah married wounded Army veteran James Reid. Together they had 2 boys and a girl. But after years of marriage, desperate financial troubles caused James to leave the family home. He abandoned Hannah and her 5 children, aged between a few months old and early teens. James Reid abruptly returned 2 years later. By this time, Hannah had moved on and was now living with 21-year-old Jonathan Waterfield. But James demanded his wife return to live with him. Hannah appeared to agree to his request. But when James's dead body was found in the nearby canal, accusations of murder were directed against Hannah Reid. But was Hannah capable of killing her husband? To begin their investigation, Sasha and Jeremy are examining the key facts of the case.
Sasha, this is a case of drowning from 1825. Now, on the 25th of April, Hannah and James set off on a journey from Shearsby to nearby Foxton to visit Hannah's sister. Hannah returned to Shearsby and told Thomas Reid, the brother, that James had gone mad and ran off. Thomas Reid didn't believe what Hannah had said. The next day, Thomas found James's dead body in the canal nearby to Foxton Locks. Hannah Reid was immediately arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. On the 3rd of August, 1825, Hannah was tried at Leicester Castle. Despite pleading her innocence, she was found guilty in 15 minutes. 2 days after her trial, Hannah Reid was executed. Well, Sasha, what do you think?
Well, it seems to me, Jeremy, there aren't any eyewitnesses to the actual incident by the canal. The other thing that might become significant is the cause of death.
And we also need to remember that this case is approximately 200 years old. The law will have changed out of all recognition. So it would be very helpful to speak to a legal historian to see what the process was at that time and how that process might bear upon the safety or otherwise of Hannah Reid's conviction.
Absolutely.
Michael and Mike have come to the area of the canal near Foxton Locks, where James Reid was said to have drowned. Could meeting canal historian Mike Beach provide valuable insight into Hannah and James's movements on that fateful day?
We know this is where it happened, the incident. Would you like to tell us about that incident?
We have Hannah and James walking here from Shearsby.
On the 25th of April, 1825, Hannah and James were walking by the canal on their way to visit her sister in the nearby village of Foxton. Hannah carried her baby, while James walked with the aid of his stick.
It's probably a 4-hour walk from Shearsby to Foxton, so it wasn't a light undertaking. No cars or anything, of course. They used the canal because it's a convenient route to get between the two.
By 6 p.m. that evening, Hannah returned to Shearsby alone. She explained to James's family that he'd suffered a manic episode, begun shouting, tearing up grass, and finally ran off.
Hannah told the family that he'd gone completely mad and all sorts of things.
Thomas Reid, James's brother, didn't believe Hannah's story. He alleged that she'd somehow brought harm to her husband. That night, Thomas and the villagers searched for James.
Didn't find the body at night, and they came back in the following morning. That's when they dredged the canal, apparently, and found the body.
After the search party found James's body, Hannah Reid was arrested. She claimed that James must have fallen into the canal and drowned as a result of his manic episode. Thomas Reid believed that Hannah pushed his brother into the water and killed him. James's post-mortem results determined his cause of death was drowning, but they also revealed a mysterious bruising to his forehead. Sasha and Jeremy are meeting pathologist Dr. Basil Perdue to discuss James's post-mortem results. Could there be some evidence to link Hannah to James's untimely death?
What we'd like your help with, first of all, is the cause of death, said to be drowning at the time. Do you agree with that?
I don't think I'm in a position to agree or disagree.
Right.
They say drowning.
Yes.
It's perfectly possible in someone who's been pulled out of a canal that they have drowned.
Yes.
And while drowning can be a difficult diagnosis, it can also be very easy.
Right. What we have got is some indication of bruising to the body. Is that consistent with somebody being once immersed in water, kept underwater once or more than once?
It's possible, and it's certainly possible for them to have the bruising before they go in.
Yes.
That can't possibly be excluded, and it's even likely.
Right.
But it's possible for someone who is still alive and whose heart is still beating while they're in the water to have something pushing or impacting heavily on the forehead and producing bruising.
Right.
Is there anything else that could be responsible for bruising type marks?
You certainly can get discoloration of the skin, which can happen after death, just by settlement of blood after death. I mean, the fact is that the evidence is so skimpy that one can't be sure.
But thank you in any event for coming along to talk to us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Mike and Michael have accompanied Mike Beach to the Canal Museum at Foxton Locks, near to where James's body was found. Could he reveal any clues as to why Hannah might have murdered James Reid?
Can you give us an insight into the background of Hannah and James Reid prior to his death?
Well, they were living in the village of Shearsby, and somehow or other he managed to agree to buy a cow off somebody, a calf, with the idea of fattening it up on a piece of land that they must have had the use of. He found he couldn't afford to pay, wasn't about to pay in the near future, so he cleared off. She would then be left struggling on her own, trying to look after children on even lower income, and things must have been getting worse and worse for Hannah.
Sometime after James deserted Hannah, she began a new relationship with 19-year-old Jonathan Waterfield, who fathered her 6th child.
That's when things started to go downhill, because James was away for a couple of years and then returned and tried to reclaim his bride. So then he and the constable turns up and says, "You've got to come home with me."
It changes everything.
Yes, changes everything. It's what's going to happen then. So Hannah was persuaded to go back to her husband against her will, we think.
Yeah, I think so.
We don't know how he treated her. He might have been quite nasty to her. 25th of April, she'd sent a note up to her husband and said, "I'm going to visit my sister in Foxton. Perhaps on the way we can sort our marriage out." And he agreed, albeit his brother saying don't go, and they set off for the 4-hour walk to Foxton village, and that's the last time anybody saw him alive, other than Hannah.
James's return after a 2-year absence and his demand that Hannah come back to live with him caused public commotion between the estranged pair. James's brother Thomas Reid also played a large part in convincing the residents of Shearsby that Hannah should return to her husband. Could this situation have given Hannah a motive to kill James? Sasha and Jeremy are analysing what took place following James Reed's sudden reappearance.
So, Jeremy, this is a map of the area of Leicestershire showing all the significant locations. We have Shearsby, where Hannah originally lived with her husband James before he deserted her. We have Foxton, where she was travelling on the 25th of April to visit her sister with James. And we have Saddington, where she lived with her new man, Jonathan Waterfield, after James had deserted her. So on the 5th of March, 1825, James, who's represented by the blue token, returns home after 2 years to see his wife Hannah, represented by the red token. Hannah stayed with him for a day, but then she returned to Saddington, where Jonathan Waterfield lived. On the 21st of April, so about 6 weeks afterwards, Hannah was found in bed with Jonathan at their house, and she was ordered by the Constable James Orme, who had been sent and accompanied by her husband James Reed to return home. She said to the constable she would not live with James, she would rather murder him.
Of course, that's just one of the comments or threats that's said to be made, but that's in the context of neighbours and villagers feeling strongly that James and Hannah ought to live together. So I think we need to approach with caution that type of evidence in the circumstances of a case such as this.
Going back to the chronology of events, on the 25th of April, Hannah ran away again back to Saddington, and between 11 and 12, still on the 25th of April, James Reed and his brother Thomas go to Saddington and they bring Hannah home for a second time. So, Jeremy, we have a picture of Hannah, who has been abandoned with 5 children in 1823. She manages to get her life together, forms a new relationship, has more children, and then out of the blue, James turns up again and expects her to revert back to being a dutiful wife. She made it abundantly clear she didn't want to be with James, and she had every reason to have him out of the way.
That may or may not be correct, Sasha, but in the circumstances of this case, there is, in my view, a complete absence of evidence that Hannah Reed actually killed James Reed. There are no eyewitnesses to the incident itself. No one who claims to have seen Hannah Reed pushing James Reed in or anything of that nature.
Hannah Reed was married to a man who was abusive, controlling. He had abandoned her, and when he returned, tried to control what she was doing when she'd made a new life for herself. She had every single reason to be rid of him.
James Reed enlisted in the British Army at the age of 21 and fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He served in the Royal Wagon Train before fighting in the Battle of Bladensburg and was eventually discharged due to his injuries. Shortly after leaving the army, James married Hannah. Michael and Mike are meeting social historian Elizabeth Hurren to find out what challenges James would have faced when trying to adapt to civilian life.
So he's been a soldier, he's been able-bodied, probably quite tough actually in himself, lots of things he's been able physically to do. And now he's been injured in his leg and his arm, and we know he's got a limp. So that in itself is quite degrading for him as a man. The buying of the calf tells us that he was indefinitely in relative poverty, and that's why he then, when he falls into absolute poverty, he can't pay the debt, then he absconds, because actually he's got no options. He's in real financial difficulty at that point. And he probably took fright and ran away. Not a great decision on his part, but quite common amongst people who are in that situation. And the thing is, when you have absolutely no money, you've got nothing left, you will do things you wouldn't ordinarily do.
Yes. But what about his poor family? That he just upped and left it? It's very selfish.
It is. And this is one of the things about being in absolute poverty, is that people take quite selfish decisions often because they're so desperate.
While Hannah Reid was awaiting trial, James's brother Thomas Reid was vigorously circulating his theory that Hannah had murdered James, which she adamantly denied. But how would her marriage to James, plus his disappearance and later return, have impacted on her mental state? Sasha and Jeremy are meeting with psychologist Professor Rod Dubrow-Marshall to get an insight into Hannah Reid's mindset at the time.
How much of an impact would this sequence of events have had, do you think, on Hannah Reid's state of mind?
The sequence of events would have had a huge impact on Hannah Reid. And also what we don't know is the extent to which there was abuse and control prior to James leaving. Both the loss of James leaving, his unexpected return, and then the way in which I believe she was coercively controlled to go back to him and forced both by him and his brother to go back to him, and indeed most likely to have sexual relations with him. Something that probably in the time may not have been seen as peculiar, but today that could even be considered rape if that was something that she was being forced to do against her will. So the psychological impact of that coercion and abuse will have been significant.
In the modern era, the defences of loss of control and or diminished responsibility might be available to a woman in the sort of circumstances met by Hannah Reid. Do you feel qualified to say whether you feel that the circumstances you've been discussing might have impaired Hannah Reid's mental capacity?
There is some evidence to suggest that Hannah suffered from potentially some form of trauma-induced loss of control, or that she was not in her right mind as a consequence of the prolonged trauma that she had suffered in the period since James's return, but also building on the loss of him leaving to begin with, and potentially finding freedom from the bondage of the relationship prior to his leaving, followed by the bondage coming back. And the psychological effect of being released from coercion and bondage and then finding it happening again to you does create a complex form of PTSD.
The prosecution at trial suggested that Hannah had connived a ruse to get James in a place where he could meet his death. Would that fit in with the profile that you see on Hannah or not?
Contriving to kill the perpetrator who is imprisoning you is actually quite a common pattern for victims of coercive control.
Right.
Because the victim is looking for any means of escape that might be available to them.
All right. Well, that's extremely clear, and I think we've got the picture. So thank you ever so much for coming to
You're
assist
welcome.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rod.
Hannah Reid's trial took place on the 3rd of August 1825 and lasted just one day. During the trial, a number of villagers gave damning testimonies against Hannah. Could these accounts have turned the jury against her? To find out about the trial proceedings, Michael and Mike have come to Leicester Castle, where Hannah's one-day trial was held.
The deceased insisted upon her going with him. She replied, "If I do, I won't live with you. I would sooner murder you." Mary Gamble deposed that the witness came to her on the 21st of April and said that her husband had insisted upon her living with him. But she added,
Damn him.
"Damn him, I do for him." E. Whitemore proved that she was present when the deceased was endeavouring to persuade his wife to live quietly with him. When she replied, "Damn you, I'll never live with you. I'll finish you between this and Monday night." I think these were put into their mouths, these words.
If you want to describe a really bad woman, that's the language you're going to use, because it will affect the jury. They're mainly concentrating on making her look bad in front of the jury. So when the jury go out, that's what they see and what they hear. When you want this woman to lose this case, you've got to paint her in the darkest of colours.
And they did.
It took the jury only 15 minutes to deliver a verdict of guilty. The judge then sentenced Hannah Reid to death. Hannah's trial took place in 1825, in an era before the modern legal system took shape. Jeremy and Sasha are meeting legal historian Professor Lindsay Farmer to find out more about criminal law in that period.
Just in general terms, how different was the criminal law in 1825 to how it is today?
It was literally a completely different world. I mean, it would be unrecognisable, I think, to a modern lawyer.
In what sense?
So there was no legal representation until 1836. There was no... a defendant couldn't testify on their own behalf.
Sorry, when you say there was no legal representation, what do you actually mean by that?
So that a person accused of a felony, a serious crime, was not entitled legally to be represented by a lawyer, to have assistance in presenting their case. There were other difficulties as well, in that a person who was accused of a serious crime couldn't testify on oath until 1898. So that meant that someone like Hannah Reid, in this case, really there was no real opportunity for her to present her own story to the court. Someone charged with murder would be able to plead self-defense or perhaps that there was provocation. So it would mean particularly women who are charged with murder in the case of an abusive relationship would have access to a defence of self-defence.
And just dealing with provocation or self-defence, that would have been available to Hannah?
Provocation and self-defence would have been available to Hannah. We have to qualify that slightly in that they would be understood slightly differently from the way they are in the present day, but it was open to plead defences of some sort if you were charged with murder.
But the judge would have no obligation to inform her?
I don't think the judge would have an obligation to inform her, no.
So therefore she could go through a trial for murder with defences technically available to her of which she was unaware?
I think that's probably, unfortunately, very likely.
Do you consider that Hannah Reid had a fair trial?
I think what I would say is that her trial was not inconsistent with normal practice, but not, therefore, necessarily fair.
Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. It's been extremely interesting.
Thank you very much indeed. What Professor Farmer told us was shocking. I mean, Hannah Reid was effectively thrown into a courtroom from jail. No legal representation, no guidance, no education, no instruction. I mean, she had no chance whatsoever.
In a dramatic twist in Hannah Reid's story, just prior to her execution, she made a shocking confession to the prison chaplain. Hannah claimed that she had in fact been responsible for James's death. Michael and Mike have come to Fleckney Library in Leicester to read her confession.
The following are her own words. As we passed under the bridge, I plunged him headlong into the navigation. He rose to the surface of the water 3 times and came near the edge. But to prevent the possibility of getting out, I jobbed him with the stick till he sunk to the bottom.
That's almost a different story, isn't it?
It is almost a different story.
Yeah.
Who did she confess this to? Was this, you know, and what pressure was she put under to make this confession?
Yes, it's the why I confess at this point. That is the troubling thing. I mean, why? She had already been convicted and she was going to die. So why make a confession? It doesn't seem...
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense at all.
On the 5th of August, 1825, 2 days after her trial, Hannah Reid was hanged. Her confession wouldn't have helped her to avoid execution. So what caused her to admit to murder? Jeremy and Sasha are examining the confession to determine if it could be true and what reasons she might have had to confess.
Sasha, whether her confession was true or not, in my view, is an open question. But even if it was true, I think that there are features of her confession which clearly demonstrate that she was not guilty of murder and that she should not have been hanged. In short, what she describes is, first, I did this without feeling the slightest emotion. Secondly, that having walked off, she felt for the first time something, quote, check me, telling me that I should be hanged. So I think that the comments made by Hannah Reid, even if she was making a true confession, are synonymous with someone in a state of extreme emotional distress. So I think, even if her account is true, that at most she was culpable for manslaughter, and certainly in the modern era, it's extremely unlikely she'd have been convicted of murder.
Her intentions, by inference, were to do serious harm to her husband.
Well, to push him in.
Or to drown him.
So whether there was pressure on her to confess, I don't know. The principal question for Judge Radford to consider is going to be whether he is prepared to or should take account of what Hannah Reid said to the prison chaplain. I don't think he ought to. I think that the question whether the conviction is unsafe must be dependent on the evidence put before the criminal court at trial, and she wasn't even legally represented. The confession, in my view, should be factored out altogether because it's unreliable in terms of what weight the judge can put upon it for the purpose of assessing the safety of the conviction. That's what I feel.
Well, I'd like to think about that.
Right. When a person is in Hannah Reid's position, a confession can conceivably be worth nothing. There's always the possibility of inducement, hope. So one has to be very, very careful about the confession in those circumstances.
It's unknown what became of Hannah's body after her execution. Typically, cadavers of the condemned would be handed over to anatomists for dissection. However, if Hannah's last-minute confession was for religious reasons, this potentially allowed her to escape dismemberment but be buried in unconsecrated ground. To pay their final respects, Mike and Michael have returned to the grounds of Leicester Castle, where Hannah was sentenced to death.
It's been a wonderful journey. We've learned on the way.
To see where everything happened, I think was the most emotional part.
That brings it to you, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, it's been emotional. And now it's in the hands of the judge to see whether it was deemed unsafe.
And we'll be happy with that.
Sasha and Jeremy have completed their investigation and must now put their submissions before the judge.
I think Hannah Reid's conviction is manifestly unsafe. It was unsupported by evidence. She had no proper, fair trial. She was deprived of any realistic opportunity to advance her case.
Hannah Reid confessed that she brought the life of her husband to an end. Whether that made her guilty of murder or manslaughter depends entirely on how one views her state of mind, given the fact that she was in a controlling and abusive relationship.
For Michael and Mike, today is the chance to clear their relative's name after nearly 200 years.
After 12 years of trawling through all the evidence, to come to this and to find the verdict unsafe will be fantastic.
Michael, hello, again. And Michael.
Hello. Hello there.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
Well, today's Judgment Day. How are you feeling?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Really good.
You are?
Looking forward to it.
Right.
I know that since we last met, you've been on a journey, really, looking at Hannah's, what happened to her in her last few days. How has that made you feel?
Well, it's made me feel I want to give this woman a chance.
Yes. Well, I think the judge is ready for us now, so if you follow me, we'll go in and put forward our arguments and we'll see whether your confidence is well-founded.
Okay.
Let's go.
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Judge David Radford. With over 14 years as a senior judge, he's tried some of the country's highest-profile murder cases. But what will he make of this alleged drowning?
Please take a seat. We are here today for me to consider the safety of the conviction for murder of Hannah Reid for the killing of her husband James Reid. Half of the defence submissions, would you like to address me, Mr. Dean?
Yes, Your Honour, please. Now, there was no eyewitness evidence to the death of James Reid, let alone anyone in a position to assert that it was at the hands of Hannah Reid. And in the overall scheme of the case, there was no cogent evidence whatsoever. Now, to compound that, in the course of this inquiry, we have had very great assistance from Professor Lindsay Farmer, who is an eminent expert in legal history. And Professor Farmer, in effect, told us that the judge failed to identify which defences were available to Hannah Reid, and so she effectively participated in a trial by her presence without any understanding of the process or any legal knowledge whatsoever. Now, the last point is heavily supported by what a modern-day psychologist has told us, that is Professor Rod Dubrow-Marshall, because Professor Dubrow-Marshall has stressed that the psychological impact of her circumstances were very significant, and it's likely that she was not in her right state of mind. This could even have been post-traumatic stress disorder, so she would have had precisely the kind of symptoms which in the modern era would fairly and squarely underpin a defence of provocation at least. So in conclusion, for all the reasons I've outlined, I submit Your Honour should regard Hannah Reid's conviction as unsafe.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Dean.
Jeremy has delivered his submission, but will Sasha fight to uphold the original conviction?
This was.
Turning to the facts of the case of Hannah Reid, there was clear evidence at trial that her husband, James Reid, was an abusive and controlling husband. So the motive in this case is very clear. Hannah Reid also had an opportunity to dispose of her husband when on the 25th of April, 1825, she was walking with him to Foxton down the canal. And that, of course, also presented her with the means to dispose of him. The psychologist we consulted, Rod Dubrow-Marshall, considered that Hannah exhibited all the signs of a woman who had been subjected to prolonged abuse. But the real issue in this case is whether Hannah Reid was deprived of advancing a defence available to her due to her lack of representation. And I consider that she was so deprived. Professor Lindsay Farmer, the legal historian, made it plain that there was a defence of provocation available to a defendant in 1825. That being the case, Hannah was deprived of a defence available to her, which would have resulted in a partial defence to murder, and it cannot be said in those circumstances that she had a fair trial. And we would invite you to support Mr. Dean's submission that this is a verdict for murder, which was unsafe.
Thank you, Miss Ross. Well, I shall reflect upon these submissions. I'm grateful to both of you. If you enable me to do so, perhaps I could invite you to leave so I can then decide what to do.
Thank you.
The legal arguments have now been presented to Judge Radford. But have the barristers done enough to question the original conviction?
All right, we've now been in to see the judge. You've heard submissions. What's your reaction?
I'm still with the unsafe verdict, I think.
Yep. I hope so, because as you will have gathered, Sasha didn't disagree.
No.
That doesn't necessarily mean that the judge will do what we're asking him to do. So I don't think we can ever say it's in the bag, all right?
All right, well, shouldn't be too long now.
Did Hannah Reid murder James Reid by deliberately pushing him into the canal? Or was she the victim of an unfair trial in a staunchly patriarchal society? Judge Radford is now ready to deliver his verdict.
In this case, Hannah Reid had, nor was she entitled to any legal representation. She could not give evidence on her own behalf. At the trial, the judge did not seek to advise her upon the law, and indeed, whilst correctly directing the jury that she could only be convicted by them if they were satisfied of proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt, expressed his own personal opinion that that standard had been achieved. That summary makes it clear that this lady did not receive a fair trial by any modern yardsticks, whatever may have been the state of the law in 1825. There is no doubt that those such as Hannah Reid, accused of murder and tried in 1825, faced formidable difficulties in defending themselves on what was, of course, a crime for which only a sentence of death could be passed as the penalty if a verdict of guilty was returned by the jury. Against this unclear factual background, I judge that the manifold failures to enable Hannah Reid to have a fair trial and proper defence advice and representation is of critical significance. Taking account of all that I have read and heard, I have concluded, whatever the level of suspicion, the profound failure to afford Hannah Reid a fair and proper trial means that, in my view, in this case, the verdict of guilty of murder was an unsafe one. That being my conclusion, I shall rise.
Well, you must be absolutely delighted.
Fantastic, wonderful, a wonderful decision. The unsafe verdict was a fitting conclusion to 12 years of research on this case.